Hey guys, James from SIKKY Manufacturing. Today we're going to show you how to install our SIKKY ISF headers. It's going to be a step-by-step guide. I'm going to show you all the tips and tricks that we've learned over the years of installing hundreds and hundreds of these things, and hopefully it'll make your job a little easier when you're installing them yourself. Alright, let's open this box up, see what comes with the SIKKY header. So you're going to have a right and left hand header. This is obviously passenger side. And the driver's side. Cool. And the hardware kit, which has the dipstick tube, 2 brand new gaskets for the collector side, and the O2 extensions, as well as the microprocessor. So we also have a detailed PDF install instruction guide on the website, so go check that out and definitely read through it step by step. This is no doubt a very difficult job. I would highly not recommend doing it on the ground with jack stands. Obviously we're going to be using a lift today, and it's about the only way to do it safely and quickly. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's probably a 9 for install difficulty, so I gotta recommend you have a professional do it, take it to a shop, but if you're brave enough to try it on your own, hopefully this will help make it a little bit easier. Alright, step 1, remove center, cover, passenger. Careful not to lose the clips. Next step, you want to get your intake air box out of the way. So you want to loosen this clamp between the tube and the air box. Unplug your mass airflow sensor. Move the clip off the air box and it might be helpful to loosen the intake a little bit, allow it to rotate up out of the way. And remove the intake air filter. And you're going to want to disconnect this little vacuum hose here. Next we're going to undo this engine harness ground. All these things we're removing are to gain clearance when we have to take the dipstick tube out and put the new dipstick tube in. Alright, next thing to do is I gotta get this fuse box out of the way. The dipstick tube nut is way down in here, and in order to access that a little bit easier, you just gotta loosen this up. You don't have to fully remove it, but getting it out of the way is important. To get the fuse box out, you need to remove a 10mm nut and a 10mm bolt to access the 10mm bolt that's down on the dipstick tube bracket. Then gently pull up on the fuse box and slide this stuff out of the way so you can get down. And now you can see the 10mm bolt down here. That's what you got to remove to get the dipstick out. I find it's easiest to use a ratchet wrench in this situation. There's not a lot of access to this bolt. Voila. Alright, now that you got that bolt out, you can kind of jiggle the dipstick tube, and there's an O-ring once it pops up out of the engine block. You simply slide it up out of the engine. Note that if your engine is overfilled with oil, oil will come out when you pull the tube out. This engine is actually filled just right to the middle of the 2 dots, so we don't have that problem. But if you see oil on the ground, it means you overfilled your engine. For now, we're done on top of the engine, so it's time to get under the car. Alright, one helpful tip to remember before you lift the car up, lock the steering wheel in the straight position, because in a further step we're going to have to disconnect the steering knuckle. It just helps getting it back together. Yep. Now we're going to remove the engine splash shield and the transmission splash shield. And we found a socket. Alright, so now we got to get the engine splash shield out of the way. Whole bunch of 10mm bolts holding this on, and a couple plastic retainer clips. Next step is remove these sway bar splash shields. One 10mm bolt and a plastic clip. Be careful not to break these, they're pretty fragile. Next step is remove the oxygen sensors, the rear ones. Really helpful to use one of these deep O2 sensor sockets because of the heat shields that we have around these O2 sensors. Just gives you the access. And you don't need to fully remove these from the car. You can unscrew them from the exhaust, kind of let them hang out of the way. Our next step, we got to remove this converter exhaust support bracket, bolts to the transmission, and the converter bolts, all 14mm. Alright, next step, we got to get these two braces out of the way so the exhaust can kind of hang down enough to get it out of the way of the new headers. You don't have to fully remove these two plastic panels, but this rear brace does extend beyond the plastic panels in each direction, so if you take out just the plastic screws around this area, it'll allow you enough access without having to fully remove the whole panel. Alright, so now that you got all this plastic screws out around the bar, you can flex this down enough where you can get a wrench in there. Alright, so now we're going to remove this first bracket. And now the rear bracket. Next, we're going to remove these two rear spring bolts so we can remove this whole midsection of the exhaust. Last step to get the exhaust out, got to remove these last two front collector bolts. We got to get both of the sway bar U brackets off, fully remove them so the sway bar can hang down. Alright, next step, we're going to want to mark the steering shaft with a line on each side of the knuckle where you take it apart. It's just going to make it a little quicker and easier to slide it back together and have the same alignment with the steering wheel and the front wheels. So we always use a paint marker. I like to put an arrow on the knuckle so you know which way is top and bottom, just to make sure. Now you want to unbolt the knuckle on the top and the bottom. Now you got those two bolts out, you want to slide the knuckle off the steering rack and then pull it back down off of the column. Voila. Once you get the knuckle out, it's helpful to go back in and kind of tighten up your marks on the steering, make it a little bit easier when you put it back together. Alright, so next step, you want to support the front of the engine. We're not lifting the engine, we are supporting it, so just keep that in mind. You don't want to actually raise the engine up. Make sure you're on the crank pulley and the timing cover and not lifting up on the oil cooler. So we like to use a little wood block that gets up between this gap here. Alright, make sure it's supported, like I said, not lifted, just snug and not going anywhere. Now we're going to take off the 17mm nuts that are on the bottom of the engine mounts where they go through the subframe. All right, next step, we're gonna remove the tow hook brackets on the right and left side. It's helpful if you mark them left and right, you know, left driver, right passenger, so less confusion putting it back together. All right, so next step, we're gonna remove the two front 19mm bolts that are holding the front of the subframe up. You're gonna let this down nice and slow. I like to alternate back and forth. And eventually the whole front subframe is gonna hang from the suspension. Keep in mind we're supporting the engine, so the engine's gonna stay in its position, but the actual subframe is gonna lower out of the way. Next step, we're going to remove these two small splash shields. There's one on the left and the right side. Next step, you're going to want to remove these two small steel dampers on either side of the engine mounts. They're not going to be needed, and they cause a clearance issue with the new larger headers. They're held in by 10mm bolts. Okay, so next step is kind of up to you. I recommend taking the O2 sensors out before pulling the header out. On some of the older models, like 2008, 2009, it's very common. I'm not sure what happened on Toyota's manufacturing side, but it's like they cross-threaded all the sensors into the headers because they pretty much destroy themselves on the way out, or it just could be how old they are. So sometimes it's not possible to get that sensor out of the header while it's up in the car, just because it takes literally a torch to get it to even budge. But since we have to take off the heat shield that's up on the upper side of the header to access the header bolts to the head, I'm going to make an attempt to get the sensors out, and like I said, I'll have to deal with it if they do not want to cooperate. So just like I suspected, the O2 sensors were extremely difficult to get out. What I find, you turn about a quarter turn and it'll start to get real tight. So leave it as loose as you can get it. Take some PV blaster, squirt it up in there, let it sit a couple minutes, and then tighten it back down, loosen it back up, kind of like you're tapping a hole, and it'll kind of work its way out and cleanly and not damage the threads. You just gotta be real careful. If it starts to get tight on you, just stop there. If you try to muscle it out, you're definitely going to blow out all the threads and not be able to reuse your sensors. And depending on what sensor you use, you're looking at probably $200 a piece, maybe as cheap as $140. But either way, take your time getting the sensors out. It's going to make your job much easier getting the heat shield off of the header too, so we can remove it. But good stuff, works great every time. Next step, we're going to remove the heat shield that's on the upper side of the factory exhaust manifold. The driver's side is held on by 10mm bolts. In order to get the heat shield out, you do have to kind of flex it a little bit and bend it to get it down past the steering column and the different brackets that are on the manifold. Don't be worried about tweaking it or bending it. It's not going to get reused with the new headers. The passenger side has three 10mm bolts holding the heat shield on. Unfortunately, they put one on the front side of the manifold behind the alternator, which is tough to get to. It's doable. I recommend a ratchet wrench. Now that we got the heat shields out of the way, it's time to remove the 8 12mm bolts from each manifold and take the stock manifolds out. So this install is going to require a pretty creative combination of different length extensions, wobble extensions, universal sockets. Just on this particular side of the passenger side, I was able to use an extension and a socket to get all but 2 off. On the back one, it actually worked better just using 3/8 ratchet and a deep socket to get the back one off. You can't barely even see it. And then the last one, it's really difficult, kind of in between 2 of the runners. I'm going to attempt to do the same thing with the socket, so see how that goes. Now we're going to remove the stock manifold, gently work it down. There she is in all her glory. This is one of the reasons why the SIKKY headers make so much more power. You can see how they combined 3 of the ports into 1 tube, and this front runner has, you know, its own access back to this really crappy merge here. You got like a 90-degree angle that air's blowing right into the side of the header, pinches down all over the place. And this is a 5-liter V8 engine. They're jamming through this really tiny little header, and this explains why this 2008 had the exhaust leak. Also another extremely common problem with these ISF manifolds, and you don't even know what the dealer wants to charge you for this thing. It makes the SIKKY headers an extreme bargain. So this is clearly why this thing sounded like a lawnmower, but luckily this thing's going in the scrap bin. This gasket can be reused as many times as you want, as long as it's not damaged. I've yet to see one of these leak from reusing a gasket. And the SIKKY manifold flange is machined perfectly flat, so it does a really good job sealing, and I've yet to see one of these leak at the ports. So I recommend reusing the gasket. Again, it's up to you. You can buy brand new factory ones if you want, but you really don't need to. And now we're going to remove all the nuts for the driver's side manifold. Now we can remove the manifold. Don't be afraid to pull down on the subframe while you're doing this too. A little bit of rotation and pulling, prying, pushing usually gets it out. Again, same thing as the other side. Extremely restrictive. This one's actually not broken, so, but I'm sure it's only a matter of time. All right, so after you get the manifolds out of the way, you can see the factory exhaust wire hanger contraption here. You no longer need that. We're going to get that out of the way and then unplug the O2 sensors from the harness. Remove the whole O2 sensor, and you can discard this hanger clip. It's not going to be reused. On the passenger side, all we got to do is unplug the O2 sensor and remove from the wire clip. And then you want to take the little wire that's normally holds the O2 sensor and just bend it out of the way. And you can cut that little wire clip out of the way so it's not rattling on anything. Next, you're going to want to remove the 17mm nut on the top side of the driver's engine mount. Pull down on the subframe and remove the mount. So the next thing you got to do is remove this piece and this rubber cover that's on the motor mount, and then you put this back on. We're not going to be reusing this. Now that that rubber cover is removed, we're going to put the motor mount back in. So reverse the same process. Start the bottom bolts first. Just be careful when you're moving the engine and subframe around. You want to avoid moving it extreme distances. Again, we don't want to break any of the wires or hoses or connections. Put the 17mm nut back on and snug it back up. On the passenger side, you're going to remove the whole engine mount and bracket off the block. You don't need to separate the mount at this point. On this front upper engine mount bracket bolt, I find it's best to use the universal socket because it's just about impossible to get anything else up there. Next we got to remove 17mm nut just like we did on the driver's side. We're going to remove the cover just like we did on the driver's side and discard this. We're not going to reuse it. There's one extra step on the passenger side. This boss here is no longer needed. It was part of the heat shield, but we're going to actually trim this off so it's flush, and you can use cutoff wheel, grinder, whatever you want. Either way, you just kind of follow this line and totally remove it. As you can see, we trimmed the boss off, smoothed off, and ready to put back together. Now install the mount and bracket assembly back in. And then reinstall the 14mm bolts that we removed. Next, you're going to want to carefully remove the SIKKY O2 extension harnesses from their packaging. Be careful not to honestly cut the wires. These are going to be used to extend the harnesses down to the new location of the O2 sensors, which is further away than the factory ones were. These are high quality OEM-like connectors, shrink wrapped and insulating. So you're going to basically just plug this back in like the factory O2 sensor. Make sure you hear a good click, give it a tug, and then we're going to want to route these carefully. We like to bring them down along the transmission wires and then get them up out of the way, and then take a zip tie, get up in there and make sure it's secured so it doesn't move in the future. You can tuck it behind this transmission power steering cooling line and attach it to that line. Same process for the driver's side. Plug it in. And this side you can attach to the wiring harness coming down on the transmission and trim off the zip tie. Alright, so you want to double check, make sure your factory manifold gaskets are still up on the head studs, and then we're going to slip this passenger side header up in first. Again, be patient. You know, you're going to have to work with some different angles and slightly pry down on the subframe, but it does go in there relatively easy. Alright, so once you get it close up into this position, you do need to find a good spot to pry the motor over, because it'll get, if you don't pry it over, it gets stuck right here, but give it a little pressure and it gets past that point. and then you got it up in location. So once you get it slid up onto the studs, before moving to the driver's side, you can actually start the nuts. We just don't want to tighten them down. We want the header to still be a little bit loose. So just kind of snug them up so the header doesn't fall off the studs. So on the passenger side, it's extremely tight to get the factory nuts back on the studs, but this is my tool of choice for the back 6 or so, 5 or 6 nuts. Basically 12mm universal socket on a wobble extension, and you're basically putting the nut on there and feeding it up in there, and then once you get it up on the stud, get a couple turns. Again, we're not going to fully tighten this side yet. We're just going to get them all started and not even snugged up, just start on the ends of the studs, and so the header is still wobbly and moves around. Alright, this is essentially the same as the other side with the added difficulty of the steering column that's in the way. Again, make sure your factory gasket is up on the studs and not completely falling off, and then you're going to start working the header up in there, same process, but one difference is we're going to try to position the steering column in between these runners once we get it up close. And again, you're going to have to pry down on the subframe and pry the engine over as you get closer. Alright, so now once we got it pop past there, you can see now the steering column is about to start heading in the right direction. So we're going to pry the engine over, get a little more clearance. And you can pry just about anywhere, just make sure you're not damaging something. Once you get close to the studs, we're going to get it slid up on there. And it goes on. So, just a couple quick tips here. You want to make sure this passenger side header is loose enough where the header is actually sagging off the studs a little bit, because when we push the motor over to give enough clearance on this side, it needs that extra room to move before that header hits the frame rail. The other thing to note too is if you're fighting with it a little bit, you might want to try raising your engine, maybe about 1/2 inch or an inch or so, because that allows you a little extra room above the frame rail to get it to slide right on. And then once you do all that and it's all lined up, it literally will slide right on there and you're good to go. And start all the nuts, and these you can actually snug up and tighten down at this point, and then move to the passenger side and tighten the rest. Alright, so we got all the nuts tight, went back, double checked them all, and they are all snug and good to go. I will say that is no doubt the hardest part of this install. Some of the nuts are going to require extreme creativity, 1/4 inch extensions, wobble sockets, universal sockets, whatever you want to call them, wobble extensions, even short wrenches. They're all 12mm nuts, so you're going to have to get creative, use a bunch of different combinations and angles, and just really make sure you torque them down, get them nice and snug. And it is possible, so don't give up, and you might, cuss a few times, but you'll get it done. Now it's time to reinstall the AFR sensors. Be sure to take your time threading these in. Make sure you're not cross-threading them in the new headers. You can make the connection, and you're going to want to secure the wires up out of the way. Once they're threaded in there and good to go, you can go ahead and snug them up. You can use a 22mm wrench. It's a little easier on the reinstall than getting a 2 socket in there. Just get them nice and snug, and then make sure the wires are secured and not rubbing on anything, and definitely not touching your exhaust.
If you want, you can put some anti-seize on the O2 sensors before you reinstall them, just to make it easier if you should you take them out down the road. All right, next step, we want to slowly raise the subframe back up to its original position. Just kind of making sure everything goes up like it should. The engine mount bolts should go into their holes on the subframe, and just slowly lift it up till everything's lined up. When you get about that close, you're not all the way up, but enough where you can get all the bolts started, and we're going to do that and then snug it up. Now we're going to reinstall the right tow hook bracket and the large subframe bolt and the two 14 mil. So we don't want to tighten these all the way down yet, we just want to snug them up and get them close, because then we got to get all of them started before we actually we want to reinstall the large front nut on the subframe. Again, just snug it up, you don't have to crank it down yet, and then do the same for the driver's side. Once you got the bolts started, before you snug it all the way up, you're going to want to reinstall the little side dust covers. And these just kind of flex in there and pop down onto the edge of the subframe. Like that. And then we get the one on the driver's side as well. Now we're ready to fully tighten the subframe bolts. Tighten down the large 22mm bolts all the way and you're good. And then you can remove the stand supporting the subframe. Alright, so now we're going to lower the engine back to its original position and install the 17mm nuts on the engine mount studs. Now we no longer need to support the engine, so we're going to remove this pole jack and get that out of the way. So now we're going to reinstall the steering column knuckle, and again we're going to make sure we align our line so the alignment is spot on. I do highly recommend doing a front end alignment after this install no matter what, but this just kind of gets you in the ballpark and makes things a lot easier by the time it gets to the alignment rack. Make sure you slide it all the way down so you can install the bolt. As you can see, there's ample clearance around the steering knuckle. There's a precise fitment. No issues of anything rubbing or hitting. Now we're going to reinstall the four 14mm bolts holding up the factory sway bar. Now it's time to install the factory exhaust, or if you have aftermarket, same process. You want to start the rear bolts first, and they'll help support it while you install the front. Now we're going to snug up these factory spring bolts. It's helpful to have somebody else at this point to hold the other end of the exhaust up. Now you want to carefully remove the two brand new collector to exhaust gaskets that SIKKY provides. Obviously you don't want to cut into them, so just be careful. You cut them out of the packaging. You also want to be careful not to bend them or kink them. As you can see, the factory flange has an indentation, which SIKKY gaskets are designed to fit inside like OEM, but have the proper inside diameter so they don't hang into the actual flow of the exhaust. Just like the exhaust side, we CNC machine this groove in there that holds the gasket. Not only does that help prevent exhaust leaks, but it also creates a super tight seal that should last for quite some time. Alright, so you're going to lift the exhaust into place. Again, you want to align this gasket in the grooves, making sure that everything is
centered out on the two indentations on the exhaust and the header, and then start the outside bolt. You don't want to put the inside one on yet because it's used with the brace that runs between the two headers. Just get that one started to keep the exhaust from falling. Alright, so now you're going to want to reinstall the factory exhaust manifold brace. And then the two 14mm bolts that go through the collector flange. Before you snug up the exhaust to collector bolts, make sure that the gasket in there is in the right position and not hanging out or pinched improperly. And you want to, last thing is tighten up the two 14s holding up this factory header brace. Alright, so since the wires are still hooked up and we opted not to fully remove these from the car, it's helpful if you twist this thing up counterclockwise. So as you tighten it into the bung, it just unwinds the wire. It makes it a little bit easier to install it. Just trying not to get it to double over on itself. And just tighten it up. And then move on to the driver's side. So we got everything buttoned up down here that we wanted to. We're going to leave the dust shields, splash guards, and rear braces off of this thing just so we can get it fired up, come through and make sure there's no leaks and everything, and then we'll put that on as the last step. For now, we're going to go to the top side, get this new dipstick tube in and get the dipstick in. You're going to remove the SIKKY dipstick tube from the packaging and install a little bit of grease or assembly lube, whatever you got around on this O-ring here. Alright, so after you got the O-ring lubed up, you're going to kind of lay this dipstick tube down in here, and you can see the one header runner. You want this tab facing the engine, basically right across where this airbox is. You're going to get it over that number one runner here, and then slowly start rotating this counterclockwise as you push it down, and then get it back into the area where it's going to be, and then gently work it into the hole. If you're having trouble with it from the top side, you can always lift it back in the air and then align it with the actual hole in the motor. But usually you can get it in there on its own without even going down there. At this point, I was able to rotate it in. This is a CNC bent tube, so it will line up every time perfectly, and they're all built the same. So as you can see, this one's lined up. The tab and the hole are perfectly aligned. Dipstick tube goes down through the header and into the blocks, and now we're going to reinstall that 10mm bolt into the valve cover, and the dipstick tube is done. So this is a difficult part here. You got to get this original bolt back down here through the tab on the new dipstick and into this hole. Now you're going to take your factory dipstick and install on the SIKKY provided tube. Now you're going to reinstall the fuse box. Reinstall the bolts. And the ground strap. I'm going to reinstall the intake air filter. Reconnect this vacuum line. And reinstall the factory air box. Tighten down your intake clamps. Reconnect your mass airflow sensor. At this point, you're going to want to install the microprocessor provided, and you're going to have to access the ECU and the harness inside this box right here. Once you remove the lid, peel back the wiring wrap on the second large connector to reveal the wires. The red and black wires are the O2 sensor signal wires. The white and black wire is the ground, and the gray and red wire is the switch 12 volts. We are going to tee the red wire from the microprocessor into the gray-red wire, tee the black wire into the white and black wire, then connect the ECU side of the black and red wire directly to the yellow wire, leaving the harness side completely disconnected, which we will properly insulate later. Strip the red and black wires and twist them together, then solder them to the yellow wire. Peel back the wire insulation on the gray and red wire and the white and black wire. Wrap the red wire around the gray and red wire and the black wire around the white and black wire. Then solder them together. Wrap all the connections with electrical tape or heat shrink them to properly insulate them. Include the red and black O2 sensor wires that are no longer being used. Tuck the microprocessor away and then reinstall the cover.
Now that the microprocessor is installed, we snug all these bolts up and we're ready to install the engine covers. Install the driver's side plastic cover. Last but not least, the engine cover. Everything's buttoned up. It's time to fire this thing up, test it for any leaks. Alright, so we just got done firing this thing up. No leaks with the new SIKKY headers. So now we're going to go ahead and reinstall the braces and the splash guards, and this will be a wrap. I'm going to reinstall this rear brace. Reinstall the plastic clips for this cover. Reinstall the left cover that goes around the sway bar and supports the engine cover. And the right. Now we're going to install the transmission cover. Alright guys, that's a wrap for this install. Keep in mind, installation like this can be frustrating and time consuming, so take your time, make sure it's done right, and you'll be happy with the product. Enjoy your SIKKY headers, and see you next time.